I was days away from finalizing an adoption when the birth mother made a confession that made me no longer want the child. My husband and I had been trying to have a baby for 4 years with no success. After our third failed round of IVF, we decided to look into adoption. The agency called us 6 months later and said they had a birth mother who wanted to meet us. Her name was Chloe, and she was 22 years old and 6 months pregnant. We drove to the agency office and sat across from her in a small conference room. She was tiny and soft-spoken with long brown hair. "I want my baby to have a better life than I can give them," she said quietly. "When I saw your profile, I just knew you were the right family." I started crying right there. My husband asked her questions about her health and her pregnancy, and she answered everything honestly. Before we left, she looked at me and said, "I have a really good feeling about this." I told her we did too. 2 weeks later, Chloe texted me asking if I wanted to come to her next ultrasound appointment. I met her at the hospital and we held hands while the technician showed us the baby on the screen. "It's a boy," the technician said. Chloe looked at me with tears in her eyes. "A son. You're going to have a son." After the appointment, we went to lunch and she told me about growing up in a small town a few hours away. "Do you have family nearby?" I asked. She got quiet. "Not really. It's kind of just me now." I didn't push. Over the next month, we started texting every single day. She sent me updates about how she was feeling, and I sent her photos of the nursery we were setting up. One afternoon, she asked if she could come see it in person. She came over that weekend and walked around the room touching everything. "This is perfect," she said. "He's going to be so happy here." My husband came home and the three of us had dinner together. Chloe talked about how she loved painting and wanted to go back to school someday. My husband asked gently about the baby's father. Chloe's whole body tensed. "He's not in the picture," she said. "It's complicated." We didn't bring it up again. By month 7, Chloe was coming over twice a week. She helped me pick out paint colors for the nursery and hung up decorations with me. We went shopping for baby clothes together and she'd hold up tiny outfits and laugh. "I can't believe how small these are." One day while we were folding onesies, she said, "I want to stay in touch after he's born. Like, I want to be part of his life if that's okay." I told her of course that was okay. "You're family now," I said. She started crying and hugged me. By month 8, I loved Chloe like she was my own sister. When she was 9 months pregnant, I threw her a small shower at my house with just a few close friends. She seemed overwhelmed by all the gifts and kept saying she couldn't believe how generous everyone was. After everyone left, she helped me clean up. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "I'm really scared about giving birth." I held her hand. "I'll be there with you the whole time if you want me to be." She nodded. "I really want that." We were just 5 days away from her due date when she texted me. "Can we meet?" "Just the two of us. There's something I need to tell you before the baby comes." I drove to meet her at a park near my house. She was sitting on a bench looking more nervous than I'd ever seen her. I sat down next to her. "What's wrong? Is the baby okay?" She nodded. "The baby's fine." "It's not that." She was wringing her hands. "I need to tell you the truth about his father. You deserve to know before you finalize the adoption." I told her she didn't have to tell me anything if she wasn't ready. She shook her head. "No, I need to say this. The father is my brother, my biological brother." I just stared at her. We grew up together, and when I was 19, we realized we had feelings for each other that weren't normal. We tried to stop, but we couldn't. We've been together for 3 years. She was crying now. "I know it's wrong. I know everyone would think it's disgusting, but he's the only family I have left, and I love him. When I got pregnant, we both knew we couldn't keep the baby because of what people would think and because of the genetics and everything, but I needed you to know the truth before you took him home." I sat there completely speechless, wondering if we'd just made the biggest mistake of our lives. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was made of stone sitting on that park bench. Chloe kept talking, but I couldn't hear the words anymore over the ringing in my ears. She reached for my hand and I pulled back like she'd burned me. She was crying hard now, saying she was sorry over and over. I stood up without looking at her and walked to my car. She called after me, but I didn't turn around. I got in and started driving. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight they hurt. The drive home took 20 minutes, but I don't remember any of it. I just stared straight ahead at the road. When I pulled into the driveway, my husband's car was already there. I sat in my car for a few minutes trying to figure out how to say this out loud. I walked inside and he was in the kitchen making dinner. He looked up at me and his smile disappeared. He asked what was wrong and I just stood there. He came over and put his hands on my shoulders and asked again. I told him we needed to sit down. We went to the kitchen table and I made myself say the words. "The baby's father is Chloe's brother, her biological brother. They've been together for 3 years." My husband stared at me like I was speaking another language. He asked me to say it again. I repeated it and watched his face go blank. We just sat there looking at each other. Neither of us knew what to say. The clock on the wall ticked and ticked. My husband finally spoke and said we needed to back out right now. He said this was too much and not what we agreed to. I heard myself defending Chloe even though I felt sick inside. I said at least she was honest with us. He stood up and started pacing. He said honest would have been telling us months ago. I said she was probably scared. He asked if I was serious right now. I didn't know if I was. We went back and forth for what felt like hours. He kept saying the baby could have problems and we didn't sign up for this. I kept saying we couldn't just abandon them now. Neither of us was really listening to the other. We were both so tired. Around midnight, he said he couldn't do this anymore tonight and went to bed. I stayed at the kitchen table. Later, I walked upstairs, but I couldn't go to our bedroom. I went to the nursery instead. I lay down on the floor and stared up at the ceiling. The elephant mobile we hung together last month spun slowly from the ceiling fan. We'd spent so much time in this room getting it perfect. The crib was ready. The changing table was stocked. The closet was full of tiny clothes. A baby boy was supposed to sleep here in less than a week. Our son. Except now I didn't know if I could do this. I didn't know anything anymore. The next morning, I was awake before the sun came up. I hadn't really slept. My husband was still in bed, so I went downstairs and made coffee with shaking hands. I found the adoption agency's number in my phone. I called as soon as they opened at 9. The receptionist answered and I asked for Kylie. My voice didn't sound like my own. She asked if everything was okay and I said I needed to speak with Kylie right away. She put me on hold. Kylie picked up a minute later. I told her we needed an emergency meeting because Chloe told us something important. Kylie asked if the baby was okay and I said yes, but this was about something else. She must have heard something in my voice because she said she could see us that afternoon at 2. I thanked her and hung up. My husband came downstairs and asked if that was the agency. I nodded and told him we had a meeting at 2. He poured coffee and we sat at the table again, not talking. We drove to the agency office in separate cars because my husband had to go back to work after. Kylie met us in the lobby and took us to her office. We sat in the same chairs where we'd sat so many times before talking about baby names and nursery colors. This time felt completely different. Kylie sat across from us with her notebook and asked what was going on. I looked at my husband and he looked at me. I made myself say it. Chloe told us the baby's father is her biological brother. They're in a relationship. Kylie's pen stopped moving. Her face stayed calm, but I saw her eyes get wider. She asked us to tell her exactly what Chloe said. My husband explained it this time. Kylie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said in her 15 years doing this work, she'd never dealt with something like this before. She said she needed to talk to her supervisor, Neil, before she could advise us on next steps. She asked if we were okay, and I almost laughed because nothing about this was okay. Kylie asked what we were feeling right now. I realized I didn't even know how to answer that. My husband said he was worried about genetic problems. He said he didn't know what it would mean to raise a child born from something like this. I said I was trying to separate my feelings about Chloe's situation from my feelings about the baby, but I couldn't figure out how. Kylie wrote things down in her notebook. She said these were all valid concerns. She said we needed to take time to process this and think about what we wanted to do. My husband asked what our options were. Kylie said legally we could still back out since the adoption wasn't finalized yet. She said the agency would support whatever we decided. Hearing her say we could back out made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. We could just walk away from all of this. We drove home separately again. That evening, my husband started talking about backing out, and I felt myself get angry. He said I was being too emotional and not thinking about the practical side. I snapped at him that he was being cold. I said he was acting like the baby was broken and we could just return him. He raised his voice and said that wasn't fair. I raised mine back and said none of this was fair. We said things we'd never said to each other before. Mean things. Things we couldn't take back. He grabbed his pillow and went to the guest room. I heard the door close. We'd never spent a night apart in our whole marriage. I lay in our bed alone and cried until I couldn't anymore. The next day, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. I typed into the search bar about genetic risks for children born from siblings. Pages and pages of results came up. I clicked on medical sites and read studies and statistics. Some of the numbers were really scary. Higher risks for certain diseases and conditions. But other articles said most babies born this way were actually fine. The data went both ways. I kept reading for hours trying to find something that would tell me what to do. But every article just made things more complicated. Nothing was clear or simple. I wanted someone to just tell me the right answer, but there wasn't one. My phone buzzed on the table next to me. A text from Chloe. "Can we talk? I need to know you're okay." I stared at the message. My thumbs moved over the keyboard, but I couldn't think of what to say. I sat there for 20 minutes just looking at those words on my screen. My husband came into the kitchen and asked if that was her. I nodded. He said I shouldn't answer until we knew what we were doing. I put my phone face down on the table, but I kept thinking about Chloe waiting for a response that wasn't coming, wondering if we were going to take her baby or leave her with nothing. My phone rang the next morning while I was still sitting at that kitchen table. Kylie's name showed up on the screen. I answered and she asked if we could come back to the agency. She said she talked to Neil and they had information about our options and what this meant legally. Her voice was careful and professional, but I could hear something else underneath it. She suggested we might want to talk to a therapist who works with adoption situations. I said yes to everything because I needed someone to tell me what to do. We set up both meetings for the next 2 days. After I hung up, I just sat there holding my phone. My husband came in and asked what Kylie said. I told him about the meetings and he nodded and poured himself more coffee. Neither of us knew what else to say. The rest of that day moved in slow motion. I kept picking up my phone and putting it down. I wanted to talk to someone, but I couldn't tell anyone what was happening. By afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I texted Piper and asked if she could meet me for coffee. She wrote back immediately asking if everything was okay. I said I needed to talk. She told me to meet her at the place near her apartment in an hour. I got there first and sat in a corner booth away from other people. Piper walked in and took one look at my face and sat down fast. She asked what happened, and I made her promise not to tell anyone. She promised. I told her everything starting from the park bench with Chloe. I watched Piper's expression change from confused to shocked to something I couldn't name. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. She asked me what my gut was telling me. I almost laughed. I said my gut was screaming 10 different things and I didn't know which one to listen to. Piper stirred her coffee and looked at me. She asked if I was more upset about the brother and sister thing, or about what it might mean for the baby's health. I realized I'd been avoiding that exact question. Both things bothered me, and I didn't know which one should bother me more. Piper said lots of babies get born into weird situations. She said maybe the real question was whether I could love this specific baby no matter how he got made. I didn't have an answer for that. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said whatever I decided, she'd support me. I left the coffee shop feeling just as confused, but at least not so alone anymore. That night, my husband and I talked again, but calmer this time. He sat on the couch, and I sat in the chair across from him. He said he was scared that if we took the baby, we'd always think about where he came from when we looked at him. I admitted I worried about the same thing. But I also said I was scared of walking away from Chloe and the baby when they needed us. He asked how we were supposed to make a decision this big. I said I didn't know. We agreed we needed help from someone who knew about this kind of stuff. He said he'd go to the therapist meeting with me. That was the first time we'd really agreed on something since the park. The next day, we drove to Addison's office. She had a calm voice and didn't look shocked when we explained everything. She listened to the whole story without interrupting. Then she asked us to do an exercise. She gave us each paper and a pen. She told us to write down what we thought adoption would be like when we first started versus what it actually turned out to be. I stared at that blank paper for a long time. I'd imagined a grateful young mother and a healthy baby and a simple process. I'd imagined feeling purely happy. The reality was so far from that I almost couldn't write it down. When we shared what we wrote, my husband's list was short and practical. Mine covered the whole page and was mostly about feelings. Addison nodded like this told her something important. Then she asked us to imagine 2 different futures. One where we adopted the baby and one where we didn't. She wanted us to describe what our lives would look like in 5 years in each situation. My husband wrote about logistics and money and how we'd handle medical issues. I wrote about relationships and whether we'd regret our choice and how we'd feel about ourselves. When Addison read them, she said it was clear we were coming at this from totally different places. She said that wasn't bad, but it meant we needed to really listen to each other. The session ended and we scheduled another one for next week. I felt exhausted, like I'd run a race. In the parking lot, my phone buzzed. A text from Chloe. It said she understood if we needed space, but could I please just let her know we were okay? I looked at the message for a long time. My husband was already in the car waiting. I typed back that we were processing everything and we'd be in touch soon. Her response came back in seconds. She said she was sorry for ruining everything. I got in the car and my eyes started burning. By the time we pulled out of the parking lot, I was crying so hard I couldn't see. My husband drove us home in silence while I sobbed in the passenger seat. 2 days later, we went back to the agency. This time, Neil was there with Kylie. They sat across from us at the same conference table where we'd first met Chloe. Neil explained that legally we could back out any time before the adoption was final. He said the agency would support whatever we chose, but they needed to know soon. He used the phrase alternative arrangements, and it made me feel sick. That was my son he was talking about like he was a package that needed delivering. Kylie added that Chloe had been calling multiple times every day asking if we'd decided. She said Chloe was really struggling and needed to know one way or another. My husband's jaw got tight. He said Chloe made this mess by lying from the start. I understood why he was mad, but I also knew Chloe had been terrified of exactly this reaction. Kylie and Neil exchanged a look. Neil pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. He said we might want to talk to a genetic counselor to understand the real medical risks instead of just worrying. He said this person worked at the hospital and specialized in high-risk pregnancies and genetic stuff. I took the card and stared at the name printed on it. Neil said knowledge might help us make a clearer choice. I called and made an appointment for the next day. I was still searching for some concrete fact that would make this decision obvious. Something that would tell me the right answer. But I was starting to think no such thing existed. The genetic counselor's office was in a medical building attached to the hospital. We sat across from her at a small desk covered in pamphlets about genetic testing and inherited conditions. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her 30s, with short blonde hair and a calm voice. She asked us to explain the situation, and I stumbled through it while my husband sat rigid beside me. She listened without any visible reaction, and then pulled out a chart showing how genetic traits pass from parents to children. She explained that siblings share about 50% of their DNA, which means they're more likely to carry the same harmful genes. If both parents carry a recessive gene for a disorder, their child has a 25% chance of inheriting both copies and developing the condition. But she said the key word was if. Without testing both Chloe and her brother, We couldn't know what specific genes they carried or what the actual risk was for this particular baby. She showed us statistics on a screen. Children born from sibling relationships have roughly double the baseline risk for certain genetic disorders. That sounds scary until you realize the baseline risk is already pretty low for most conditions. She talked about things like cystic fibrosis and sickle cell disease and various metabolic disorders. My husband was taking notes on his phone. I just sat there trying to process numbers that felt both huge and small at the same time. The counselor said the uncertainty was often harder for parents than knowing there would definitely be problems. At least with certainty you could prepare. With uncertainty you just had to wait and see. My husband asked if the baby would be tested after birth. The counselor explained that standard newborn screening catches some conditions but not everything. She pulled up a list of what the state tests for automatically. It was longer than I expected, but still just a fraction of possible genetic issues. She said many conditions don't show up until later in childhood or even adulthood. Some developmental delays might not be obvious until a child starts school. Some health problems might not appear until teenage years or beyond. I realized we could adopt this baby and spend years waiting for problems to show up. Every time he got sick or seemed slower to hit a milestone, we'd wonder if it was connected to how he was conceived. The counselor must have seen something in my face because she said that many children born from consanguineous relationships are completely healthy. She used that word, consanguineous, like it made the situation more clinical and less disturbing. She said we shouldn't assume the worst, but we also shouldn't ignore the elevated risks. She offered to connect us with a support group for parents dealing with genetic concerns. My husband asked what percentage of children from sibling relationships have serious problems. She hesitated and said it's hard to give an exact number because many cases aren't reported or studied. The research is limited and often biased. She estimated maybe 15 to 20% have significant issues, but that was just an educated guess, which meant 80 to 85% were probably fine. My husband latched onto that number like it was a life raft. On the drive home, he kept saying 80% odds aren't bad. I pointed out that 20% odds aren't good either. Would he get on a plane if it had a 20% chance of crashing? He got quiet after that. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while my husband snored softly beside me. Around 3 in the morning, I finally drifted off and immediately started dreaming. In the dream, I was holding a baby boy. He had dark hair and dark eyes, and he was perfect. But every time I looked away and then looked back, his face had changed. Sometimes his eyes were different colors. Sometimes his features were blurred like an out-of-focus photograph. Sometimes he looked totally normal. And sometimes there was something wrong I couldn't quite identify. I kept trying to see him clearly, but he kept shifting and changing. I woke up crying, my pillow wet with tears. My husband was already awake, lying on his back staring at the ceiling. I reached for his hand and he squeezed it tight. We stayed like that for a long time in the dark, not talking, just holding on to each other. Both of us carrying the weight of this choice we had to make. I could feel his hand trembling slightly, or maybe it was mine. The clock on the nightstand said 4:30. Neither of us went back to sleep. 3 days before Chloe's due date, she texted asking if we could meet in person. I'd been avoiding her calls and keeping my responses short, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. I suggested a coffee shop halfway between our house and her apartment. When I walked in, she was already there, sitting at a corner table. Her pregnant belly was huge under an oversized gray sweater. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She stood up when she saw me, awkward and slow. Before I could even sit down, she started talking. She said she was sorry. She said she should have told us from the beginning, but she was terrified we'd reject her and the baby. She said she'd been carrying this secret for months, and it had been eating her alive. She said she understood if we hated her. I sat down and ordered coffee I didn't want just to have something to do with my hands. She kept apologizing, talking faster and faster, her voice getting higher. Finally, I told her to stop. I said I didn't hate her, but I was confused and scared and I didn't know what to do. She started crying, wiping her eyes with a napkin that immediately fell apart. She said she needed to explain how it happened. She said it wasn't what I probably thought. Chloe told me that she and Remy were both in foster care as young kids. They were separated when they were really little and adopted by different families in different states. She didn't even remember having a brother until she was 18 and decided to search for her biological family. She found Remy through some kind of sibling registry website. They started emailing and then talking on the phone. They met in person when she was 19 and he was 21. She said it felt like finding the only other person in the world who understood her. They'd both had rough childhoods in foster care. They'd both felt alone their whole lives. When they met in person, there was this instant connection. She said they tried to keep it as just a sibling relationship, but feelings developed that neither of them expected or wanted. They fought it for months. They knew it was wrong, but eventually they couldn't help it anymore. She said what they have is real love, not something sick or twisted. She said people might not understand, but they understand each other. I sat there listening and trying to figure out how I felt. Part of me wanted to tell her that love doesn't make something okay, but another part of me could see the pain in her face and knew she wasn't some monster. She was just a person who'd made complicated choices in a complicated situation. I asked her why she decided to tell us now, 5 days before the due date, instead of just keeping it secret forever. She could have let us adopt the baby, and we never would have known. She looked down at her coffee cup and said she couldn't do that. She said she'd thought about lying, had almost convinced herself it would be better for everyone, but she kept imagining us finding out somehow years later and feeling betrayed. She said she needed us to make an informed choice even if it meant losing us. She said her baby deserved parents who went into this with their eyes open. I felt angry and sad at the same time. Angry because she'd waited so long to tell us. Sad because I could see she was trying to do the right thing even though it was destroying her. I asked her why she didn't tell us at the beginning, when we first met. She said she was afraid. She said she'd already been rejected by 2 other couples who found out about her and Remy. She said when she met us and saw how much we wanted a baby, she convinced herself she could keep it secret just long enough to get through the adoption. Then the secret would die with her and everyone would be happy. But as we got closer and she started to care about us, the lie got heavier. She said she couldn't let us take her son home based on something that wasn't true. Chloe looked at me with red, swollen eyes and asked directly if we were still planning to adopt the baby. I had to tell her honestly that we didn't know yet. We were still trying to figure out what to do. She nodded like she'd expected that answer. She didn't seem surprised or even upset, just resigned. She asked if we would at least meet him after he was born before making a final decision. She said she understood if we couldn't commit now, but she wanted us to see him and hold him before we decided anything. I promised we'd be at the hospital when she went into labor. The words came out of my mouth before I'd really thought about them. I wasn't sure if it was a promise I should be making. What if we met the baby and fell in love with him, and then decided we couldn't go through with it? Wouldn't that be worse for everyone? But Chloe looked so relieved when I said it that I couldn't take it back. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said thank you over and over. I finished my coffee even though it had gone cold. We sat there for a few more minutes not really talking. Then she said she needed to get home and rest. I walked her to her car and watched her drive away. I sat in my own car for a long time before starting the engine. The next morning I woke up to my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a text from Chloe. 3 words. I'm in labor. My husband was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed looking at his own phone. He'd gotten the same message. We looked at each other across the bedroom. Neither of us said anything. We both just started getting dressed. I pulled on jeans and a sweater. He put on the same clothes he'd worn the day before that were draped over a chair. We moved through the house like robots, not talking, not making eye contact. The drive to the hospital felt strange and slow, like we were moving through water. Every traffic light seemed to take forever. My husband kept both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. I watched the buildings go by outside my window. Neither of us turned on the radio. The silence in the car was heavy and thick. I kept thinking about turning around and going home. I kept thinking about what we were about to walk into. But we kept driving. When we got to the hospital, we asked at the front desk for Chloe's room. The woman looked it up and gave us directions to the labor and delivery floor. We took the elevator up in silence, found the right hallway, found the right room number. The door was partially open. I could hear Chloe's voice inside, talking to someone. My husband hesitated in the doorway. I pushed past him and walked in. Chloe was in the hospital bed with monitors attached to her belly. Her face was red and sweaty. She reached for my hand the second she saw me and I took it without thinking. Her grip was strong, almost painful. She was breathing hard through a contraction. My husband stayed by the door, his back against the wall. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't know what to do with his hands. A nurse was checking the monitors and writing something on a chart. She smiled at us and said Chloe was progressing quickly. Should be ready to push within the hour. Chloe squeezed my hand tighter and made a low sound in her throat. I found myself automatically rubbing her back like I'd seen in movies, even though I had no idea if it was helping. A young man appeared in the doorway behind my husband. I knew immediately it was Remy, even though Chloe had never described him to me. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair that fell across his forehead. He had the same soft features as Chloe, the same dark eyes, the same small nose. The resemblance between them was obvious now that I was looking for it. They could have been twins instead of siblings 2 years apart. He froze when he saw us. His eyes went wide. Chloe looked up and saw him and her whole face changed. She said his name. Then she looked at us and her voice got shaky. She introduced us as the couple she'd told him about. Remy stood in the doorway not moving. My husband stepped aside to let him in, but Remy stayed where he was. He looked at us, and then at Chloe, and then back at us. He said, "Thank you for being here." He said he knew this was complicated. His voice was quiet and careful. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. My husband made a sound that wasn't quite agreement or disagreement. The tension in the room felt like something physical, like the air had gotten thicker. Remy finally stepped inside and moved to the other side of Chloe's bed. He took her other hand. She looked up at him, and something passed between them that made me look away. The nurse said she needed to check Chloe's progress and asked if we wanted to step out. I started to leave, but Chloe tightened her grip on my hand. She asked me to stay. Remy let go and stepped back toward the door. My husband followed him out into the hallway. The door closed behind them, and it was just me and Chloe and the nurse in the room. The nurse checked Chloe and said she was at 8 centimeters and things were moving fast. She adjusted the monitors on Chloe's belly and wrote something on a chart. Chloe gripped my hand hard through another contraction, her whole body going tense. I counted out loud like I'd seen people do in movies, not knowing if it helped but needing to do something. When the contraction passed, Chloe relaxed back against the pillows, breathing hard. The nurse left to get the doctor, and it was just the two of us. Chloe looked at me with tears in her eyes and thanked me for staying. I wiped her forehead with a wet cloth from the table beside the bed. Another contraction started, and she squeezed my hand so hard I thought my bones might break. The doctor came in about 20 minutes later. A woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a bun. She introduced herself and checked Chloe again. She said it would probably be another few hours, but everything looked good. Chloe asked if the people in the hallway could come back in. The doctor said yes, but warned that once pushing started, she'd need to clear the room except for one support person. Chloe nodded. My husband and Remy came back in, and the air got thick with tension again. Remy moved to Chloe's other side and took her hand. My husband stayed near the door like before. Nobody talked. We all just stood there listening to the beeping of the monitors and Chloe's breathing. Time moved strange, both fast and slow at the same time. Contractions came every few minutes, and each time Chloe would grip both our hands and breathe through the pain. Between contractions, she rested with her eyes closed. During one of the quiet moments, she looked at me and started talking in a low voice. She said Remy really wanted to be here for the birth, but she told him it might be too much for us to handle. She said he's a good person who loves her and loves this baby even though they both know they can't raise him. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to tell her I understood, but I didn't understand any of this. I just wiped her forehead again with the cloth and told her to focus on her breathing. Another contraction hit, and we went back to the routine of counting and squeezing hands. The doctor came back around 6 o'clock and checked Chloe again. She said it was time to start pushing. She looked at everyone in the room and said only one person could stay. Remy started to move toward the bed, but Chloe shook her head. She looked at me and asked if I would stay with her. Remy's face fell, but he nodded and stepped back. My husband touched his shoulder and they both left the room. The nurse came in with more equipment and the doctor got into position. Chloe pushed for what felt like forever. She screamed and cried and squeezed my hand until I lost all feeling in my fingers. The doctor kept saying she was doing great and to push harder. I stood beside Chloe's head and tried to be encouraging even though I felt completely useless. The whole thing was messy and raw and nothing like the peaceful birth scenes I'd imagined. After about 40 minutes, the doctor said she could see the baby's head. Chloe pushed 3 more times and then suddenly there was a baby, red and screaming and covered in white stuff. The doctor held him up and said it's a boy and he looks perfect. She put him on Chloe's chest, and Chloe started crying harder than she'd been crying from the pain. She looked down at the baby and then up at me with this expression that broke something inside me. She asked if I wanted to hold him. I froze. I didn't know if I should. Everything in me wanted to reach for him, but everything in me was also screaming to run. The nurse was doing something with the umbilical cord. Chloe kept looking at me waiting for an answer. I took the baby because saying no felt too cruel. The nurse helped me position him in my arms. He was so small and warm, and he smelled like something I couldn't describe. His eyes opened and looked right at me. They were dark blue and unfocused, but it felt like he was seeing me anyway. My heart cracked open in a way I'd never felt before. I loved him, and I was terrified of him at the exact same time. I stood there holding this tiny person, and felt like my whole world was splitting into 2 different futures. The nurse took him after a minute to clean him up and do whatever tests they do. She weighed him and said 7 pounds 3 ounces. She wrapped him in a blanket and put a little hat on his head. Then she brought him back to Chloe, who held him against her chest and cried. Someone must have told my husband it was okay to come back because he appeared in the doorway. He saw me standing there and walked over slowly. He looked down at the baby in Chloe's arms and his whole face changed. All the hardness from the past few days melted away. He reached out and touched the baby's tiny hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around his finger in that automatic way newborns do. We looked at each other over this baby, and I could see we were both thinking the same impossible thing. How do we walk away from this? How do we leave this baby behind after holding him and feeling his grip and seeing his eyes? Remy came in behind my husband and stopped at the foot of the bed. He stared at the baby with an expression I couldn't read. Chloe looked up at him and held the baby out. She asked the nurse if it was okay, and the nurse nodded. Remy took his son and held him like the baby might break. He brought him close to his face and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then he kissed the baby's forehead through the little hat. Watching him be so gentle while knowing he was both the baby's uncle and father made me feel sick. This whole thing felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Remy handed the baby back to Chloe after a minute and stepped away. My husband and I stood there not knowing what to do or say. The nurse started cleaning up and the doctor left to check on other patients. Time kept moving forward even though I wanted it to stop. A woman in professional clothes came in a few hours later and introduced herself as Julia Lozano, the medical social worker. She asked if she could talk to me privately. We went out into the hallway and she led me to a small office down the hall. She closed the door and asked how I was doing with everything. I broke down completely. I told her I didn't know if I could do this. She handed me tissues and said that was a completely valid feeling. She explained that the hospital needed to know our intentions within 24 hours so they could make plans for the baby's discharge. She said there were other families waiting if we decided not to move forward. The way she said it so calmly made everything feel more real and more terrible. I told her I needed to talk to my husband. She said of course and gave me her card with her phone number. I went back to Chloe's room, but it felt too crowded, so I texted my husband to meet me in the cafeteria. We sat at a table in the corner at 2 a.m. drinking coffee that tasted like dirt. The cafeteria was almost empty except for a few tired-looking people in scrubs. My husband said he thought we should walk away because the situation was too complex and the risks were too unknown. I said I thought we should move forward because the baby deserved a family and we promised to be that family. We went back and forth like this for over an hour. Every time one of us made a point, the other one had a counter-argument. We were stuck. Then he asked me a question that made everything harder. He asked if I could really see myself explaining to our son someday that his biological parents were siblings who were in love with each other. I tried to imagine that conversation and felt my certainty start to crack. He asked if I was prepared for the judgment we'd face if people found out. I realized I hadn't thought about the social implications at all. I'd been so focused on the baby and Chloe and the genetics that I hadn't considered what it would mean to live with this secret, what it would mean to lie to family and friends about where our son came from, what it would mean if the truth ever got out. My husband reached across the table and took my hand. He said he knew this was the hardest decision we'd ever have to make. He said whatever we decided, we had to decide together. I looked at his tired face and felt the weight of everything crushing down on us. We sat there in that empty cafeteria, while somewhere upstairs a baby boy slept in a hospital bassinet, not knowing that his entire future depended on what 2 exhausted people decided in the next few hours. I walked back upstairs to Chloe's room because I needed to see the baby again before making any decision. The hallway was quiet except for the beeping of machines and hushed voices from behind closed doors. I pushed open Chloe's door and found her sitting up in bed with the baby at her breast, nursing him while Remy sat in the chair beside her. They looked like a real family in that moment. Remy had his hand on Chloe's shoulder, and they were both staring down at the baby with expressions of pure love mixed with sadness. I stood in the doorway feeling like an intruder watching something private and sacred. Chloe looked up and saw me standing there. She asked if we had decided yet, and her voice was barely a whisper. I shook my head and told her we were still trying to figure everything out. Remy looked at me with red eyes like he'd been crying, and I realized how much pain they were both in. The baby made small sounds while he nursed, and Chloe adjusted the blanket around him with gentle hands. I sat down in the other chair, and we all stayed quiet for a few minutes, just watching the baby. Then Chloe said something that made my whole body go still. She told me that she and Remy had been talking all night, and they had made a decision about their relationship. She said they were going to stop seeing each other romantically after the adoption was done. My mouth fell open because I wasn't expecting that at all. Remy nodded slowly and said they realized their relationship made everything harder for everyone, including the baby. Chloe's voice cracked when she said they were willing to give up being together, so the baby could have a normal life with us. She said it was the right thing to do, even though it was killing them both. I felt something twist in my chest because the sacrifice they were offering was huge. They were willing to give up not just their son, but also each other. The nobility of it hit me hard, but so did the tragedy. I asked Chloe if she was really willing to lose both her baby and the man she loved. She started crying, and the tears ran down her face onto the baby's blanket. She said she didn't have any choice because this was what was best for him. Remy covered his face with both hands and his shoulders shook. When he looked up, his eyes were destroyed. He said they had talked about it for hours, and this was the only way to give the baby a real chance at a good life. He said they loved each other, but they loved their son more. I sat there watching them fall apart, and something shifted inside me. I realized they were making an impossible choice, and it made me question whether I had any right to judge what they had together. They clearly loved each other deeply, even if society said it was wrong. The baby finished nursing, and Chloe held him against her shoulder to burp him. She patted his back gently and whispered to him that everything would be okay. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there feeling the weight of their sacrifice pressing down on all of us. After a while, I told them I needed to go find my husband, and we would give them an answer as soon as we could. Chloe nodded and thanked me for coming back to see them. I left the room and walked down the hallway feeling more confused than ever. The next morning, a pediatrician came to examine the baby while we were all in Chloe's room. She was an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun, and she handled the baby with confident hands. She unwrapped him from his blankets and checked everything carefully. She looked in his ears and eyes and mouth. She listened to his heart and lungs with her stethoscope. She measured his head and checked his reflexes by tapping his tiny knees with a small hammer. The baby cried during parts of the exam, but mostly he just looked around with wide eyes. My husband and I stood against the wall watching every move the doctor made. Chloe sat in the bed biting her thumbnail. Remy had left earlier that morning after the nurses told him visiting hours were over. After about 20 minutes, the pediatrician wrapped the baby back up and handed him to Chloe. She said the baby was perfectly healthy with no obvious signs of any genetic problems. She explained that all his newborn screenings had come back normal. My husband let out a breath he'd been holding and asked if that meant there were no issues at all. The doctor said she couldn't promise nothing would show up later because some conditions don't appear until kids get older. But right now, everything looked good. She said his heart was strong and his lungs were clear and all his parts were formed correctly. My husband grabbed onto this information like it was a life preserver. He said maybe the genetic risks weren't as bad as we thought. The doctor left, and my husband looked at me with hope in his eyes for the first time since Chloe's confession. I wanted to feel relieved, but I couldn't shake the worry that something might still be wrong down the road. That afternoon, we met with an attorney named Matthias Finch in a small conference room at the hospital. He was a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and wire glasses. He shook our hands and sat down across from us with a leather folder full of papers. He said he understood we were in a complicated situation, and he was here to explain our legal options. My husband asked if we were required by law to go through with the adoption. Matthias said no. We had no legal obligation to proceed, and we could withdraw at any time before the adoption was finalized. He explained that if we did decide to move forward, the adoption would be handled exactly the same as any other adoption. He said the biological relationship between Chloe and Remy didn't need to be disclosed on any public documents. That surprised me because I thought it would have to be part of the official record. Matthias explained that adoption records focus on the birth mother and the adoptive parents, and the details about the father's identity were not required unless there were custody concerns. My husband leaned forward and asked what would happen if Chloe or Remy tried to get the baby back later. Matthias said that once an adoption is finalized, the birth parents have no legal rights to reclaim the child. He said the law was very clear about that, and there were strong protections in place. He explained that both Chloe and Remy would have to sign papers giving up all parental rights permanently. My husband asked another question about what would happen if genetic problems showed up later as the baby grew. Matthias said we would have the same rights and responsibilities as any adoptive parents in that situation. He said the adoption agency might have some support services available, but legally we would be fully responsible for the child's care. Everything Matthias said was practical and made sense from a legal standpoint, but none of it addressed the emotional mess we were dealing with. He couldn't tell us how to feel about raising a child born from incest. He couldn't promise the baby would be healthy. He couldn't guarantee we wouldn't regret this decision. All he could do was explain the legal framework, and that felt completely inadequate. We thanked him for his time and left the conference room with a stack of papers we were supposed to read and sign if we decided to proceed. That evening, we drove to Addison's office for an emergency therapy session. She had agreed to see us after hours because we were running out of time to make our decision. We sat on her couch and she asked us what our hearts were telling us versus what our heads were saying. I told her my heart said this baby needed us and we already loved him. But my head said the situation was too complicated and we weren't equipped to handle it. My husband said his heart and head were both telling him we should walk away. He said he kept trying to imagine raising this child, and he couldn't see it working out. Addison asked him what specifically he couldn't see. He said he couldn't see himself bonding with a baby who came from such a wrong situation. He said he was afraid he would always think about how the baby was conceived every time he looked at him. I felt my stomach drop because I had the same fear, but hearing him say it out loud made it more real. Addison nodded and said that was an honest concern that needed to be addressed. She asked if we had considered that many adopted children come from difficult circumstances, and parents learn to separate the child from their origins. My husband said this felt different because it wasn't just a difficult situation. It was something most people would consider morally wrong. Addison didn't argue with that. Instead, she asked us what we thought we would regret more in 5 years. Would we regret adopting this baby and facing unknown challenges? Or would we regret walking away and always wondering what happened to him? My husband said he would regret getting into a situation we couldn't handle. I said I would regret abandoning a baby who needed us. Addison pointed out that every adoption involves unknowns and risks. She said this situation was more extreme, but maybe not fundamentally different from other complicated adoptions. My husband's face got red, and he said this was absolutely fundamentally different. He said most adopted kids aren't the product of incest between siblings. Addison stayed calm and asked him if he thought the baby was less deserving of love because of how he was conceived. My husband didn't answer right away. Finally, he said he didn't think the baby deserved less love, but he wasn't sure he could give that love knowing the truth. I realized in that moment that my husband and I might not be able to agree on this. We had always made big decisions together, but this one was tearing us in different directions. We sat in Addison's office for another hour going in circles. She asked us questions that made us think but didn't give us any answers. Finally, she said we needed to make a decision based on what we could live with long term, not what felt easiest right now. She reminded us that the hospital needed our answer by tomorrow morning. My husband said he thought we should spend the night apart, so we could each think clearly without influencing each other. I agreed even though the idea of being away from him during this felt wrong. He went home and I drove to Piper's house. She opened the door in pajamas and pulled me inside without asking any questions. I collapsed on her couch and cried for what felt like hours. She sat next to me, rubbing my back and letting me get it all out. When I finally stopped crying, she made me tea and we sat in her kitchen while I told her everything that had happened since the baby was born. I told her about seeing Chloe and Remy together looking like a family. I told her about their decision to end their relationship. I told her about the pediatrician saying the baby was healthy. I told her about the attorney in the therapy session and my husband wanting to walk away. Piper listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me one simple question. She asked what I would do if I knew for certain the baby would be healthy and there would never be any genetic problems. I started to answer and then stopped because I realized something important. I realized my fear wasn't really about genetics. It was about having to explain this situation to our son someday. It was about telling him his birth parents were brother and sister who loved each other. It was about watching his face when he learned the truth about where he came from. Piper nodded like she understood. She said every child has a story about where they came from, and some stories are harder than others. She asked if I thought this baby deserved less love because his story was complicated. I said no immediately without even thinking. She smiled sadly and said, maybe that was my answer. Not whether the situation was perfect or easy or normal, but whether I could love this child no matter what. I sat there in her kitchen at midnight, staring at my cold tea and feeling something click into place in my mind. I barely sleep at Piper's house, tossing on her couch and checking my phone every few minutes. At 5 in the morning, I give up and text my husband asking him to meet me at the hospital. I need to see the baby one more time before we make our final decision. I drive through empty streets as the sun starts to come up, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I get to the hospital, I take the elevator to the maternity floor and walk past the nurse's station to the nursery window. My husband is already there, standing with his hands pressed against the glass, looking at our baby. He doesn't turn around when I walk up next to him. The baby is sleeping in a clear plastic bassinet with a blue knit cap on his head. His tiny hands are curled into fists near his face. My husband's voice is rough when he finally speaks. He says he's been here for an hour trying to imagine our life without this child, and he can't do it. He says he kept thinking about the nursery at home and the elephant mobile we hung together and the tiny clothes folded in the dresser. He says he thought about never knowing what the baby's first word would be or what his laugh sounds like. He wipes his eyes with the back of his hand. I take his other hand and squeeze it. We stand there together watching the baby sleep, and I feel something settle in my chest. We go to Chloe's room without discussing it, both of us knowing we've made our choice. When we push open the door, we find Chloe already dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt, sitting on the edge of the bed with the baby in her arms. Remy is standing by the window looking out at the parking lot. They both turn when we enter, and Chloe's face goes pale. She holds the baby tighter against her chest like she's afraid we're going to take him away right now. Remy moves closer to her and puts his hand on her shoulder. The baby makes a small sound, and Chloe looks down at him with so much love and pain on her face that I have to look away. My husband reaches for my hand, and his grip is so tight it almost hurts. I can feel my heart beating hard in my chest. I realize whatever we say in this moment will change all of our lives forever. There's no going back from this decision. Chloe is crying before we even speak, tears running down her face while she rocks the baby gently. I take a deep breath and tell her that we've decided to move forward with the adoption. I say we believe this baby deserves a family who will love him no matter what, and we want to be that family. Chloe's whole body starts shaking with sobs, and she bends over the baby like she's trying to protect him and thank us at the same time. Remy covers his face with both hands and his shoulders shake. My husband's voice is steadier than mine when he adds that we'll need complete honesty from them going forward about medical history and any genetic information they have. He says we need to know everything so we can take care of our son properly. Remy drops his hands and nods quickly. He says they'll tell us anything we need to know, anything at all. Chloe can barely speak through her crying, but she manages to say thank you over and over. The baby starts to fuss, and she rocks him automatically while tears drip onto his blanket. I move closer to the bed and sit down next to her. I tell her we still want her to have contact with the baby like we planned. Photos and updates a few times a year and maybe visits when he's older. She looks at me with red eyes and asks if I really mean that. I nod and tell her she's still part of this. Remy clears his throat and asks quietly if he can be part of that contact too. My husband and I look at each other, and I can see him struggling with the answer. After what feels like a long time, he says yes, but there have to be clear rules about it. He says we need to set up boundaries that everyone can follow. Remy agrees immediately and says they'll do whatever we ask. We're all crying now, even my husband, who almost never cries. Chloe asks if she can hold the baby for a few more minutes, and I tell her to take all the time she needs. She kisses his forehead and whispers something to him I can't hear. Remy sits on the other side of the bed and touches the baby's hand with one finger. They look at him together like they're trying to memorize every detail. I watch them say goodbye to their son, and I feel like my heart is breaking and healing at the same time. The adoption agency moves fast once we give them our decision. Kylie comes to the hospital that afternoon with paperwork and explains what happens next. There are forms to sign and legal steps to follow, but she says everything should be finalized within a few days. Chloe signs the papers with shaking hands, while Remy stands behind her with his hand on her back. My husband and I sign our parts, and then it's done. The baby is legally ours. 2 days later, we bring him home to the nursery we spent months getting ready. I carry him through the front door while my husband brings in the car seat and diaper bag. The house feels different with a baby in it, quieter and fuller at the same time. I take him upstairs to his room and lay him in the crib under the elephant mobile. He looks so small in there, his arms stretched out to the sides. I sit in the rocking chair we bought and just watch him sleep. My husband comes in and sits on the floor next to me. We don't talk, we just look at our son. Hours pass and I don't move from that chair. Every time the baby makes a sound, I lean forward to check on him. My husband finally goes downstairs to make dinner, but I stay in the nursery. I can't stop looking at him and thinking about how close we came to walking away. Over the next few weeks, my husband and I have long talks about how we're going to handle questions about our son's background. We agree that we'll be honest with him when he's old enough to understand, but we'll focus on the fact that his birth parents loved him enough to give him a better life. We practice what we'll say to family and friends who ask about the adoption. We decide to tell people that the birth parents wanted privacy, and we're respecting that. It's not exactly a lie. We also agree that we won't talk about Chloe and Remy with judgment even when we're frustrated or scared. Our son deserves to know his birth parents were real people who made hard choices, not villains in his story. One night, my husband admits he's still worried about what will happen when our son is old enough to ask questions. I tell him I'm worried too, but we'll figure it out together. A month after the adoption, Chloe sends her first email with photos attached. I open it while my husband is at work, and my stomach drops when I see the pictures. Chloe and Remy are together in every photo, standing close with their arms around each other. She writes that they tried to stay apart like they promised, but they couldn't do it. She says they're still together, and she hopes we can understand. She promises they'll respect all our boundaries with the baby, but they can't stop being together. I feel angry at first, like they lied to us. When my husband gets home, I show him the email, and he gets really mad. He says they promised to end their relationship, and now they're going back on their word. I point out that we never actually made them promise that. They offered it themselves. I say their relationship isn't really our business as long as they respect our rules about our son. My husband argues for a while but eventually admits I'm right. We write back to Chloe saying we appreciate her honesty and will continue with the contact arrangement we agreed on. 3 months go by fast with a new baby in the house. Our son has his first checkup with a pediatrician who knows his full background. She examines him carefully and asks lots of questions about his development. When she's done, she tells us everything looks perfect. She says she'll keep monitoring him closely as he grows, but right now there are no concerns at all. My husband and I drive home from that appointment without talking much. When we get inside, he picks up our son and holds him close. He tells me he feels like he can breathe for the first time since we found out the truth. I know we'll have more moments of worry as our son gets older, but for now we can just be grateful he's healthy. I start looking online for support groups for adoptive parents, and find one specifically for people dealing with hard birth family situations. I join a private forum and read other people's stories. One woman writes about adopting siblings who were born from father and daughter. She talks about how she handled telling the kids the truth when they were teenagers, and how she set up boundaries with the birth father. Reading her posts makes me feel less alone. I realize lots of families are dealing with things that seem impossible from the outside. Another woman adopted a child whose birth mother was addicted to drugs and keeps relapsing. Someone else adopted their grandchild after their own daughter went to prison. Every story is different, but we're all trying to do right by our kids while dealing with really hard stuff. I start posting my own story, and people respond with advice and support. It helps to talk to others who understand. 6 months after we bring our son home, Piper comes to visit. She sits on the couch and watches me feed him a bottle. When he's done eating, I burp him and he falls asleep on my shoulder. Piper says she's never seen me look so happy. I tell her that despite everything, despite all the fear and confusion and hard choices, being this baby's mother feels more right than anything else I've ever done. She smiles and says that's all that really matters. She asks if I'm still worried all the time about what might happen, and I admit that I am. But I'm also learning to be present with him instead of always waiting for something bad. Piper reaches over and touches the baby's tiny hand. She says maybe it's time to stop waiting for problems and just enjoy being his mom. I look down at my son sleeping peacefully against me and think maybe she's right. A few weeks later, Chloe sends a text asking if she can meet our son in person. I stare at the message for a long time before showing it to my husband. We talk about it for 3 days, going back and forth about whether it's a good idea. Finally, we agree to a supervised visit at a park near our house on a Saturday morning. I'm nervous the whole drive there, holding our son in my lap while my husband drives. Chloe is already waiting on a bench when we arrive, and Remy stands a few feet away near a tree. My husband carries our son over, and I watch Chloe's face change when she sees him. She starts crying before she even holds him. I nod that it's okay, and she takes him carefully, cradling him against her chest. She whispers something I can't hear and kisses his forehead. Remy stays back, but I can see him wiping his eyes. After 10 minutes, Chloe hands him back and thanks us for letting her see him. She says she needed to know he was happy and loved, and now she can see that he is. We say goodbye and drive home without talking much. That night, my husband sits on the edge of our bed and tells me he's glad we didn't walk away. He says he was so scared at first, but our son has changed him. He admits he never understood that love doesn't need perfect circumstances until now. Then he surprises me by saying, maybe we should think about adopting again someday. I look at him shocked because I wasn't expecting that at all. We talk for over an hour about how we feel more prepared now for whatever complications might come. The next several months pass quickly with a baby in the house. Our son starts crawling and then pulling himself up on furniture. We take him to the park and watch him laugh at dogs running past. My mom comes to visit and falls in love with him instantly. Everything feels normal and right despite how we got here. When his first birthday gets close, we plan a small party at our house. I invite just close friends and family who know our whole story. The morning of the party, I decorate the living room with balloons and set up a smash cake on the high chair tray. People start arriving around noon and everyone wants to hold the birthday boy. My husband's sister brings him a stuffed elephant that he immediately hugs. The doorbell rings and a delivery person hands me a package. Inside is a wooden toy train set and a card from Chloe. She writes that she's grateful for all the photos and updates we send. She says seeing him grow up happy makes everything worth it. I show the card to my husband and we both get quiet for a minute. Then our son bangs on his high chair tray and everyone laughs. We put the cake in front of him and light the single candle. My husband and I lean in together and blow it out while our son claps his hands and smiles. I look around the room at all these people who support us, and I feel genuinely happy. That night, after everyone leaves, I rock our son in the nursery chair. He's tired from all the excitement and his eyes keep closing. I think about how close we came to walking away from him because we were scared. Every parent faces things they don't know how to handle. Our situation is just more obvious than most. He's healthy and happy and so loved. I know there might be challenges ahead, but we'll face them together. The decision we made at the hospital wasn't perfect, but it was ours. I look down at his peaceful sleeping face and I know it was right. That's the story for today. I'm really thankful you were here to listen. I hope it made your day just a little brighter.